Hello, and welcome to Other Voices, brought to you by Peninsula Peace and Justice Center. I'm your host, Paul George. 1 year ago this month, nearly 190 nations gathered in Paris, France, to try to come to a global agreement on what to do about climate change. They came to an agreement, and 1 year has gone by, and we're going to check the progress. We have some twists and turns in the road ahead of us. We'll talk about that a little bit too. But mostly we want to talk about what's ahead for climate change and protecting our planet. And I'm really glad to have returning with us 1 year later from the last time they were here. My guests were just about to leave for Paris to participate in the climate talks. At the far end of the table, I'm pleased to welcome back Chris Field, director of the Stanford Woods Institute for the Environment and former co-chair of Group 2 of the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Chris, welcome back to Other Voices.
Thank you.
And Chris's colleague, KATHARINE Mach, senior research scientist at Stanford University and the former director of science for Group 2 of the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. KATHARINE, welcome back to you.
Thank you.
I'm really glad you could both get back here. Since it has been a year, let's just kind of review what was agreed at Paris and where it fell short, where it might have exceeded your expectations.
Sure. You want to start?
Sure. So in December of last year,
Yeah.
a big event occurred. We have now a universal climate treaty. It's actually the first time the world has ever had a climate treaty that involved action from all countries. You can think of the Paris Agreement being underpinned by a few key features. Basically, every country comes forward with a country pledge of what they're going to do to rein in emissions of heat-trapping gases and also to prepare for impacts, and where they might need some assistance from other countries to do that effectively. The other two aspects is that it's not just about a one-time pledge, it's about monitoring what they're doing through time, being very transparent to set up a system of peer pressure, and then returning to those pledges every 5 years down the road from here on out and increasing the ambition. So that was what was agreed last December, and then over the last course of the year, countries have come forward and signed and ratified it. When it passed the threshold of 55 countries having ratified the agreement, representing 55% of global emissions, it triggered entry into force. And November 4th of this year, it entered into force.
And that means it now applies to everyone who was there, or just the 55 plus who have endorsed it?
So once you get a treaty that is entered into force, you kind of get a rapid action of everyone else. So something like 187 countries have put forward pledges on the table. But right now, 118 countries have ratified. But for those remaining ones, if they haven't ratified, they don't get to sit at the table and negotiate all the details. So I think it's quite likely that we'll continue to see a rapid entry into force of every single country.
So it's not just international peer pressure, so to speak. There's real benefits to being in the negotiating room at the table, as you say.
If you haven't ratified, you're back in the observer section.
You want to add to that, or is it?
It's important to know that we crossed this threshold from not having a climate agreement to having a climate agreement. And people have talked a lot about whether this Paris Agreement is stringent enough, whether it has enough teeth. And the way I think about it is that the Paris Agreement really established a new approach to dealing with climate, and the approach is fundamentally bottom-up. Each country had an internal process that said, what's my best approach to dealing with emissions in the long term, really emphasizing what's been a core theme in the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change from its start, and it's the idea of common but differentiated responsibilities. Technologically advanced nations, ones that have access to a wide range of energy resources, have a different set of responsibilities as a result of historical emissions, as a result of current capabilities, as a result of finances, than poor nations that are just beginning the transition to electrification and energy access. There are different priorities for different countries. Some are most concerned about clean air. Some are most concerned about dealing with really existential impacts from things like sea level rise. And others are concerned about moving their economies away from a dependence on fossil fuels. When I look at the Paris Agreement, I see really two major things that were accomplished. The two major things that are accomplished are what countries around the world, as well as firms, have been asking for. One is an agreement on what's fair, what the distribution, what the timing, what the responsibilities of every country should be. 195 countries have ratified. That's what is an agreed definition of what's fair, what's the problem we're trying to solve, what's our approach going to be. The second thing the Paris Agreement provides is a sense of continuity, the directionality that we're heading, and of reliability in a compliance environment. What the Paris Agreement does not provide is a pathway to stabilize warming at less than 2 Celsius, 3.6 Fahrenheit, above pre-industrial. You could regard that as a major failing, but it's important to recognize the essence of the Paris Agreement wasn't to get us all the way to the solution. It was to start us on a trajectory so that the requirements could be ratcheted up as countries build confidence with their ability to make progress.
Yeah, this was the theme when you were on a year ago, just before the conference, was that I think you already knew at that point that the various pledges didn't add up to what we completely needed to keep it under 2 degrees, the increase under 2 degrees Celsius. But I remember you saying how important it was that we lay this basis of trust and cooperation. And I think that unarguably has been accomplished, was accomplished by Paris. Laid that basis for...
A really, really interesting feature of the Paris Agreement is the strong emphasis on a long-term target. I think last year we probably talked about the target as stabilizing warming at less than 2 Celsius, but the actual wording in the Paris Agreement is well under 2 Celsius with efforts toward 1.5. So if anything, what the Paris Agreement really did is amped up the ambition of coming to a solution that really is protective of people and ecosystems and communities around the world. What it didn't do is nail down all of the details of how we're going to get there.
Right.
And it also didn't, as a UN treaty, come with teeth, so that if individual countries or regions aren't making the progress that they're committed to, something quick, substantial, and meaningful happens. The compliance regulation has to emerge from this sort of milieu of international goodwill. Sometimes we have abundance of it, and sometimes we don't.
We don't, yeah. So there's nothing in the agreement like sanctions or fines or anything like that if a country does not keep up with its pledge. It's going to require diplomatic effort at that time to convince them to come along or something like that.
It's the system of peer pressure. And
Yeah.
as Chris described, really, the goal now is to work out a lot of the details of exactly what that will look like. So between now and 2018, the chart is set. So the countries are coming together to figure out exactly what needs to be in each country's pledge, its nationally determined contribution. Do the developed economies really need to be much more clear about exactly how much they're going to reduce emissions, how they're going to target different sectors across their economy? Do developing countries need to define what business as usual is if they say they're going to do better than what they would have done otherwise? A lot of the details will be around finance as well. There's a very notable component of these international climate agreements, which is, since 2009, in the text, an effort to mobilize $100 billion to help adaptation and mitigation efforts in developing economies. Those
100 billion, you said, right?
I hope I said that.
Yeah.
I may have slipped.
No, you said, no, you did. I just wanted to emphasize what we're talking about here.
And then towards that, there's about $10 billion that's been pledged in direct funding. But that $100 billion is kind of a complex number in that it can be both private money from business investments as Chris described, in many ways the Paris Agreement is providing that long-term signal, as well as direct funding from one government into the big pools that are dispersed from there.
All right.
And it's important to remember that in the international community, peer pressure has been effective.
Yeah.
When countries commit to things, their reliability as a partner is at issue. And if they fail to follow through on the commitments, it really erodes their ability to be regarded as useful partners in future commitments. And so there really is a lot at stake in the kinds of agreements that have been reached, even though there's not what you would call a strict exterior compliance mechanism. It's not like some hammer comes down or sanctions are imposed. But this peer pressure has a history of being quite effective.
And you could even say more effective, in that if it's very stringent top-down regulations, countries will say, no thanks. But instead what we have is a situation where all the countries are at the table really trying to do their best and working together.
And again, one of the most important things is that it's all the countries at the table. Tell me a little bit more about this 5-year review that you mentioned in the original summary of the agreement. What happens every 5 years?
Great. So part of the run-up to Paris was a really interesting development trajectory. So in some ways you could step back to 2009 in Copenhagen, which Christiane Figueres, then Executive Secretary of the UNFCCC, described as the UNFCCC's most successful failure. The goal.
Hold on, FCCC?
Sorry, already into acronyms. So the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change is the 1992 umbrella treaty for all global action on climate change. And it kind of creates the underpinning for all of these meetings that happen every year, with the big conference of the parties being the conference of the parties to that 1992 agreement. Okay,
so Framework Convention on Climate Change. You can go back to saying FCCC because I can see why you do it.
In 2009, which I believe was COP, Convention of the Parties, number 15, they were going to negotiate the successor to the Kyoto Protocol, and it was going to be top-down. And Christiane Figueres, Executive Secretary of this international body, describes it as the UN's most successful failure because so much was learned from the failure to come up with the successor to the Kyoto Protocol. And the big thing that happened was that all of the countries decided to go for this bottom-up approach. So in the run-up to Paris, what you saw was all of the different countries, US and China started in November of 2014, putting forward country pledges. For the US, it's reducing emissions by 26 to 28% by 2025 compared to 2005. China pledged to peak emissions by 2030. Then you had this flood of country pledges coming forward, and countries were either saying, here's what we're going to do by 2025, or here's what we're going to do by 2030. And so now what we have is every 5 years, starting in 2020, countries will re-up their pledge. So all of the countries in 2020 are going to say, based on what we've learned over the last few years, here's the best we can do by 2030. And that will happen from here on out.
So almost repeating Paris, the pledge part, and reviewing every 5 years.
And recognizing that the Paris Agreement doesn't get us as far as we need to go.
Right.
And a really key part of the Paris Agreement is this mismatch between the goal of stabilizing warming at well under 2 and the amount of commitments that have already been agreed for the 2025 to 2030 time period. So there's a built-in recognition that more needs to happen.
All right. Now, just last month, there was a follow-up conference in Marrakesh, Morocco. This was COP22, what is it of the parties?
Conference of the Parties. Conference of the Parties.
Paris was COP21, this was COP22. Were you both there, or
yes, we were.
In Marrakesh? I didn't see a whole lot of coverage about this, certainly not to the level of Paris. What went on with this follow-on conference?
So this was supposed to be all details, nothing exciting. It was supposed to be, what's the transparency mechanism going to look like? How do you think about finance? How do you think about all these different details, loss and damage, down the line? The notable event that occurred during this Conference of the Parties was the US presidential election, which happened on the second day of the conference of a 2-week-long conference. So in some ways, what was going to be a very humdrum occurrence was exciting for a few different reasons. First of all, the treaty had gone into force way earlier than people had expected, November 4th. And second, there was immediately a lot of question of would this be a repeat of the Kyoto Protocol, which the US never ratified, and the US failure to ratify the Kyoto Protocol was viewed as a big dent on its effectiveness and the effectiveness of global climate action. So in some ways, the question on the ground in Marrakesh was, is this Kyoto all over again? But I think in some ways what was inspiring, or at least a point that people could come together around, is the fact that the world as a whole is so much different than it was in the late 1990s with the Kyoto Protocol. There's unambiguous understanding that climate change is real. And in many ways, that long-term temperature goal that Chris mentioned, keeping warming well below 2 degrees Celsius, pursuing efforts towards 1.5, is there and that ambitious because of the recognition that impacts are already happening, and 1.5 represents a level of dangerous climate change. A second way that the world is different that I think was something people came around is that solutions are increasingly feasible. We see parts of the world where solar and wind are becoming competitive with fossil-based energy sources. We see this hope and aspiration that we're almost on the brink of clean energy being the good stuff, it really entering into an era of climate responses. And then the third thing that I think people recognized was that there's so much more momentum on the climate issue. Back in the late 1990s, the US was the world's largest emitter. At this point, China, on an annual basis, has twice the emissions of the US, even though the US is still the largest historical cumulative emitter. And that meant that everyone in some ways looked over at China to see what might happen. And the early indications were promising, with countries around the world emphasizing that this is a treaty that's meant to last and that there's determination to carry it forward.
All right. Did you want to add anything to that? You were there.
We arrived in Marrakesh the day after the election in the US, and the atmosphere we expected was one of dejection and being morose. Instead, there were really two themes that were dominant, even within one day of the U.S. election. The first was countries everywhere said, well, you know, we deal with setbacks all the time. We deal with unfriendly governments all the time. We'll find a way to deal with this situation. And the other mood that was really dominant, within hours of the results of the U.S. election being announced, was this sense that, well, this is an agenda that the world is going to carry on. We would love to have the U.S. in a leadership position. If the U.S. is in a lagging position, we're still going to carry this agenda forward. And within hours, that was the dominant mood across this meeting. And it didn't really flag the whole 2 weeks.
Interesting. So I don't want to get hung up, as I said before we went on the air, on Donald Trump and his effect on this, but we have to ask the question, since he campaigned on the fact that he was going to pull the U.S. out of the Paris Agreement. What does that mean? First of all, there are some mechanisms within the agreement that make it a lengthy process, as I understand, to quote unquote pull out of it. Can you just talk about that for a minute? What would that mean? He's using the image, tear it up,
sure,
as if that's it.
One thing I think is really important is that we really don't know very much about what a Trump administration will or won't do. Certainly there are some very discouraging signs about continuing progress on climate, and the statements during the campaign about withdrawing from the Paris Agreement are among them. The Paris Agreement is in force as a consequence of the 55 countries representing more than 55% of emissions. That's true with or without the U.S. If the U.S. chooses to withdraw from the Paris Agreement, there is a clause in the agreement that makes that possible. It's an extended period. It's a 3-year advance notice and then a 1-year withdrawal period. It's not impossible to do that. A faster pathway, if the U.S. totally chose to disengage from international climate work, would be to withdraw from the UN Framework Convention, the UNFCCC, and that's a 1-year process. There are serious consequences of both of those, not so much in terms of the impacts on climate, which are certainly serious in themselves, but in terms of the stature of the U.S. as a reliable partner on the international stage, and whether or not the Trump administration wants to sacrifice that credibility for an issue where most of the most of the things that will happen in the future are more in the area of opportunities than they are in terms of challenges is far from clear. It's actually more likely, based on the conversations I've had with people who have a long-term feel for the way the federal government works, that what we might see is just a U.S. lack of commitment to the goals, which could result in decreased finances available for developing countries. It could result in a decreased rate of progress on some of the decarbonization that we're seeing in the U.S. without officially withdrawing. But on the other hand, the Trump administration has been quite positive about maintaining the investment tax credit for photovoltaics and the production tax credit for wind energy. And they also have talked about extending permits, increasing permits on federal land for leasing for oil and gas, much of which is likely to result in an increase in gas production that will tend to drive coal out of the market. And if you look at the progress that the U.S. has made in decreasing emissions over the last decade or so, it's come from expanding wind, expanding solar, and having both those plus gas push coal out. So there are reasons to think that progress toward decarbonization in the U.S. is likely to continue largely as a result of market forces, almost independent of the policies of the administration.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. He's claimed that he's going to create 500,000 jobs a year in the coal industry, but apparently he hasn't checked coal prices recently.
You know, there is a war on coal, but it's not a war that's led by the environmentalists. The war on coal jobs was lost as a result of mechanization decades ago.
Yeah.
And then the coffin nails in the coal industry were really applied definitively by low gas prices over the last decade as a consequence of fracking. And there's no way that coal is going to come back or coal jobs are going to come back, because even if coal were to come back, there wouldn't be jobs, and coal's not going to come back because it's not price competitive, in addition to the fact that it probably kills 3 million people a year as a consequence of air pollution.
Right. Yeah, there was a story on the NPR News this afternoon about increasing black lung among coal miners because lower quality coal that they're
in the
digging
U.S., somewhere between 50,000 and 100,000 excess deaths per year are a result of inhalation of fine particulate matter from coal. 50 to 100,000 deaths per year. That's many times the number that die in automobile accidents, even many times the number that die in gun violence.
Gun violence, yeah.
And why aren't we tackling that as a primary public safety issue?
Good question. While we're on the issue of a market, let's talk about how wind and solar are doing, not only in the U.S. but around the world, of providing energy in terms of percentages of the market and comparative prices to other forms of energy that they will hopefully be replacing in the future. Is solar getting cheaper and cheaper?
Sure. Maybe just mention a few things, then turn it back to Chris. The Global Carbon Project releases a yearly set of data on what's going on with emissions and energy sources globally, and it usually releases those during the Conference of the Parties. So just to mention some of the numbers that came out in November during the Marrakesh meeting. Quite intriguingly, for the last 3 years, global emissions have been rather flat, even though it's been a time of global economic growth. That applies to China. In the US and EU, emissions have been dropping. It seems like what has been correlated with that at the global scale has largely been that coal over the last few years has been quite flat, while we've had exponential growth of renewables, even though they're obviously still a small fraction of the total energy production from fossil-based sources. There are parts of the world where solar PV arrays are quite a bit cheaper than what you get even from natural gas. There are places where wind is increasingly competitive, and we might be tipping into a market-based system where wind and solar are quite cost competitive, even once the subsidies that have in some cases really launched them into action are pulled away.
Yeah. Go ahead.
I just give a couple of numbers. In worldwide, a typical price for a long-term contract for electricity from coal or natural gas would be around 6 cents a kilowatt hour. There are now several utility-scale PV projects that have been constructed where long-term prices are under 3 cents a kilowatt hour. Solar is really, kicking butt in terms of its competitiveness in the market. Now, there's still issues with the intermittency and finding ways to do energy storage, but for areas that are rapidly electrifying, solar is just a very compelling choice. I hope we have a chance to talk about California. For the first year ever, last year in California, California got more energy from photovoltaics than it did from hydro. Part of that was consequence of the terrible drought, which is also caused by climate change. But hydro has been a real key factor in California's electricity budget over decades. And last year, PV passed it and is likely to continue to grow really, really rapidly in the years ahead.
Okay. Do you have a number, like what percentage of our energy in this country is being provided by solar and
well, in the U.S., it's
wind?
about 1% solar now and about 6% wind. Solar is growing hugely rapidly. Wind's growing very rapidly too. But when you start from zero, you can grow many, many-fold and still be a small part of the market. And when we talk about finding a way to stabilize warming within the well under 2°C goal, the primary needs are to dramatically accelerate progress in deploying not emitting sources, and they don't have to just be wind and solar. It could be nuclear, and it could be fossil plants with carbon capture and storage. It could be biomass, but it has to be non-emitting sources. And we also have to focus really heavily on increasing energy efficiency so that we don't need as much energy. And we also need to recognize that even if we are successful stabilizing temperature under 2°C, there's still going to be important impacts that need to be adapted to.
All right. Let's talk about California, because one of the things I wanted to talk about was programs and initiatives that come from other than the national government. As you mentioned earlier, we don't really know what Trump will do once he's in office, but I think we are all preparing for the worst. But if the federal government starts backing off on some of its commitments, what can be done at call it subnational level, by states, by corporations? We see big companies like Google and Facebook committing to being 100% renewable energy. But you mentioned California. What else about California in particular? I'm really glad to hear that about the...
California has been making it happen in a really impressive way. There probably has been a lot of attention in this audience towards the current goal on the table for 2020. And that goal set back in the 2006, AB 32, was to return emissions levels in 2020 to what they had been in 1990. And we're cruising towards that. That looks like it is well within sight at this point. And that's been through a whole suite of measures, increased deployment of renewables, low carbon fuel standards, a market that kind of picks up a lot of the scraps, efficiency for vehicles and buildings. Then, at the end of the summer of this past year, or this year really, a new target was put on the table through legislation called SB 32. And that goal is very ambitious. It's kind of the plunge. It's not just returning to 1990 levels, but in the next decade, by 2030, dropping emissions by 40%. That's a very substantial drop. It's largely viewed to be what is consistent with a world that could keep warming below 2°C. California has been ambitious not just within its own confines, but also in terms of building connections across cities, states, subnational actors at the global scale. There's been quite a lot of attention to something called the U2 MOU, which has well over 100 parties, which can be cities or states around the world coming together, all pledging action that is reducing emissions per person to 2 tons per person per year, or otherwise doing things that are really consistent with a high ambition mitigation pathway.
2 tons per year per person. What are we each emitting these days?
In the U.S., the number is just about 17 tons of CO2 per person per year. It's about 100 pounds per person per day. And the global average number is around 6 tons of CO2 per person per year. 2 tons per person per year is the target for 80% decarbonization. It's not the long-term target. The long-term target has to be 0. And as we think about future energy systems, we really need to remember that even if our goal is not well under 2, if it were 2.5, 3, 3.5, we would still need to reduce emissions to 0. And one of the reasons that the decarbonization agenda is so important is that the difference between stabilizing at 2 and stabilizing at 3 is only a few decades and when we need to reach 0. But the difference in impacts is immense, where in a 2-degree world, we basically can adapt to most of the impacts we'll experience. By the time we're at 3, we're beginning to see risks of system failures that are outside the range for adaptation.
Yeah. That is a huge difference, is 1 degree. Okay, are there other states that are kind of showing the way that we can talk about, that wind on the East Coast at all? Or?
I think what is quite compelling is if you say, what are the 5 states that have the largest deployment of wind? They all voted red in the last election. I think that's a very compelling reason, as Chris described earlier, why the investment tax credit, the production tax credit that really have helped push solar and wind forward, have helped make clean energy quite bipartisan in our current world.
Yeah, I think the whole issue of climate change has become a lot more bipartisan, regardless of who won the election.
Well, it's become a lot more about finding ways to build an economy that's robust, that creates a lot of jobs. No question, there are immensely more jobs in the clean energy sector than there are in coal. In fact, there are more jobs in solar now than there are in oil. So the trajectory is really clear, that the opportunities for building businesses really have many of the most attractive locuses in the clean energy space, and people understand that regardless of the politics. And it also is really clear that there are a tremendous number of benefits from being a part of the clean energy economy. If you're a farmer in Nebraska, windmills don't cut down your ability to grow corn or soybeans, but they can provide an extra source of income. If you're a farmer in Iowa, you can sell biomass into a biomass energy market and have an additional option for selling crops depending on what the market bears. So we're increasingly seeing opportunities to be a part of the clean energy market as really enticing and really driving things, and not just the issues with climate change. But then again, the problem is that we need to go faster than we're going now, and until we're explicit about the damages of climate change, we don't get the prices right. There's this unpriced subsidy that's basically being able to use the atmosphere as a waste dump that gives fossil a leg up on the kinds of other technologies that should, by all rights, be out competing it.
And we need to put a price on that.
Absolutely.
Okay. I want to turn to our audience and get you in on this conversation. And while the microphone is making its way, let me just ask quickly, are there other corporations like Google and Facebook that are committing to 100% renewable? Is there anything happening in the private sector that points other ways to the future than just Washington doing
Lots of the most exciting developments are in the private sector. Some are in alternative energy technologies. We talk a lot about Tesla, but there are many companies now that are making real progress with electrification of transportation. We're seeing more and more companies being willing to be ambitious about their sustainability goals, and that involves giant companies like Unilever or IKEA. You got to remember too that even the big oil and gas companies are saying now that they're comfortable with the price on carbon. Even ExxonMobil is advocating for a revenue-neutral carbon tax. And so in many ways, we're seeing a global stage in which non-national actors are really pushing the national actors to kind of get with the program to create an environment in which they can be successful in the long run. we need a price on carbon. There are some things that need to happen as a result of national scale policy, but we're also moving into an environment where increasingly the best opportunities are going to be those that are capitalized on by private corporations. Or let me just talk about Stanford for 1 second.
Sure.
Stanford just a few months ago inaugurated its new energy management facility. And what the energy management facility creates is essentially a giant energy storage system. People probably know that the big problem with wind and solar is that it's hard to get the energy you need when the sun isn't shining or the wind isn't blowing. But by building these giant tanks for storing hot and cold water, Stanford can now do all of its building, heating, and cooling 24 hours a day based on electricity that's available only during the daytime. And in connection with this, just 2 weeks ago, Stanford flipped the on switch on a major utility-scale photovoltaic array in Kern County that generates about 2/3 of the electricity that Stanford will use. So with this combination of the zero emissions energy from photovoltaics and this giant energy system for heating and cooling buildings, Stanford has cut its carbon emissions by 2/3 in the last year.
Wow, that is impressive.
It is impressive.
That is impressive. All right, so audience members, if you have a question or comment, just hold up your hand and wait for the microphone to arrive. And when you get the microphone, hold it right up to your mouth, and I would ask that you also stand up to make it easier on our camera people. So I don't see any hands up in this big audience. Okay, here they come finally. So let's start in the back and work your way forward, Crystal.
Hi, sorry, I have a cold. You mentioned fracking offsetting the cost of coal.
It doesn't come out real loud.
You mentioned fracking driving down the cost or the value of coal. Could you talk a little bit about fracking and the
Sure.
broader cost of
Yeah.
fracking?
Yeah, so exploration for natural gas by breaking up the rocks underground, horizontal drilling and hydraulic fracturing is a technology that's been totally transformative in making the U.S. energy independent and in driving down the price of natural gas. It drove the price of natural gas down about 6-fold so that natural gas is really cheaper than coal for most power applications. There are a series of potentially very serious problems that come from the fracking technology. The most serious problems have been what to do with the fracking fluids and whether or not they're contaminating water supplies, and whether natural gas is contaminating water supplies and potentially creating health hazards. The fracking technology just blew up on the energy scene around 15 years ago, and during the earliest phases of the fracking boom there was incredibly poor regulation. A lot of the natural gas production, oil and gas production, is still regulated at the state level, and there's some states that do a better job than others. But my sense of the issues with fracking are that in terms of the contamination issues, the natural gas leakage into water and the natural gas leakage as a greenhouse gas, is that we have the technologies available to do a really good job with those, and that the big problem now is the diversity among operators. And I don't want to come across as an apologist for the oil majors, but the majors are mostly operating with very low impacts in terms of water quality or leakage, and it's the cowboy operators and the old installations where there's most of the leakage. I'm convinced that responsible application of fracking in a regulatory environment that's really robust can play an important role in helping drive the last of the coal out of the energy system. The big problem is that you need a regulatory environment that's robust. You need to be thoughtful about where the fracking wells go in, and you need to be really assiduous about making sure that industry best practices are applied and maintained.
Okay, good question. Okay, over here.
Hi, my name is Marna. Thank you both so much for your good work. I really appreciate everything that you're bringing to the table and to the planet. My question is about, I guess solar specifically, it sounds like a really good idea, but I have to admit I don't understand what happens on the flip side of solar tools. The decomposition process, is it as responsible as it seems? Are there ways to use foresight in even the mineral and metal use of those tools so that they could be reused in the future and not gleaning different, parts of the earth to get those pieces? And also the panels themselves, do they decompose in a way that's regenerative and responsible for the planet? Thank you.
Interesting question.
Yeah, so that's a great question, and it touches on something we should all think about, the issue of life cycle impacts, life cycle analysis. What are the environmental issues associated with getting the raw materials for building the panels? How much energy does it take to make the panels? And then what do you do once they're worn out? Solar photovoltaics last a really long time. Most of the modern installations are designed to last something like 25 to 30 years. Making solar panels is very energy intensive. You basically have to melt sand and make it into this pure silica crystal and grow the crystal. And the life cycle analysis that's been published recently has indicated that for solar panels that were made 25 years ago, basically all the electricity they made during their whole life just essentially repaid the energy that went into them. But like many other things, the technology has improved dramatically through time. And so now solar panels have a high enough output that they can repay the energy that goes into making them within just a couple of years of operation. So the bulk of the energy that's produced by a solar panel, even if the energy used to make it came from coal, is really offsetting fossil fuels, and it really is fossil free. Quite a lot of the materials that are required for photovoltaics are rare elements that require mining, sometimes in precious areas. And a lot of the technology development that's going into solar panel research now is to try and find ways to replace these rare elements with much more common materials, or materials that can actually be synthesized in the laboratory. And right now there's kind of a race. The material, the solar panels based on silicon and rare earths are striving for higher and higher efficiency so that you can get the same amount of energy out of lower panels. And some of the efficiency numbers are just dramatic. They're getting up to 50% of the light energy showing up in electricity energy. But then other groups are saying, you know, what we really ought to be focusing on is super cheap materials that might even be available as like a paint that you can make from plants, and that might be much less efficient in terms of the energy generation, maybe 5 or 10% efficient, but super cheap to make. And I think it's too early in the technology race to know which of those fundamental approaches are going to win, and I suspect we'll see both being active in the marketplace in different kinds of settings as we move forward.
The good news being that there's a lot of activity going on to discover new and better ways of generating.
Well, the U.S. Department of Energy has been critical in funding the research to drive the feasibility of non-emitting energy sources. And one of the things that is a deep concern with the incoming Trump administration is whether renewable energy research and low-emission energy research will continue to be a priority for the Department of Energy.
How much money are we talking about, do you know?
I think the R&D budget of the Department of Energy is between $4 and $6 billion a year. And it includes all of the national labs, which are really crown jewels in the nation's science infrastructure, a lot of university research. And corporate research is really good for taking things from once the fundamentals are understood to driving down the cost of deployment. But the basic research really needs to happen in government-supported laboratories.
Yeah, so that's a struggle on the horizon, given who our new energy secretary is going to be, probably. Another question here in front.
Yeah, well, first of all, I want to thank you for the fascinating information you've offered us and all the work you've put into over the years in collaborating with other workers in this field. I have a specific question about the regulatory environment. You both touched on emissions, and monitoring of emissions is something that we're going to need to carry out to know how we're doing, what isn't getting adequately addressed, other gases like methane as well as the CO2. So I was wondering, given that we do have a lot of uncertainty about our federal government's willingness to carry out the emissions monitoring processes, is there another route by which we can track what's actually happening effectively? I just have no idea on that.
You want to speak to that?
There are a lot of different ways to think about how we have really good understanding of where emissions are coming from and how much they are. They range from measurements that go back decades, the Keeling curve, for example, in Mauna Loa and Hawaii, through to methods that are about eddy flux towers, what's happening at the surface of the Earth, and top-down satellite measurements that, of course, have a very strong government underpinning. There are many ways that some dimensions of that will continue irrespective of the level of government funding, but the government provision for maintaining those data sets is critical, and it has been critical. In terms of who's doing the careful science that comes into interpreting all of those data, it happens in a lot of different contexts. There's a lot of academic work, including at Stanford, that's really saying how do we use sophisticated modeling to infer from the global satellite-based measurements where those different emissions are coming from. At the same time that the US EPA has really advanced a lot of the methods for the bottom-up accounting. How many cows do we have? How much emissions do you get per cow? How do you kind of devolve what works at a global scale into much more nuanced applications across the US?
One of the things that's been a top priority for the Obama administration is to increase the accuracy and transparency of the global emissions reporting system, which is basically a country-centered activity. But increasingly what we're seeing is that there are independent checks on that. And just as the science of climate change is fundamentally rooted in multiple lines of independent understanding, that we're seeing multiple lines of independent verification on emissions. A good example is you can very accurately and pretty easily measure the change in the CO2 concentration of the atmosphere from year to year. And if the numbers that countries are producing don't add up to the change in the atmosphere, along with the sinks, then you know something's amiss. We also are seeing NGOs being increasingly effective in this monitoring space. Many of you probably know that with the really horrendous natural gas leak at Aviso Canyon earlier this year, that it was the Environmental Defense Fund that did the initial monitoring of that. And I think what we're seeing now is the emergence of an environment in which independent science organizations, NGOs, will be able together to provide an increasingly number of kind of cross-linked constraints to see if the numbers that are being reported by governments really do add up.
Okay. Any more hands in the audience? Over here on the far side, and then there's another one going to be up front here, Crystal.
I was Googling for some information the other morning, and I was very pleasantly surprised to learn, I think I learned that electric vehicles, sales of electric vehicles are doubling now the last few years, doubling. That's a large increase. Almost says that in like 10 years we'll have mostly electric vehicles on the road. Is that too optimistic to expect? How do you foresee us changing our transportation sector? Maybe another question has to do with the new Toyota push for hydrogen vehicles, particularly in Los Angeles. Is that a viable technology?
You want me to take that?
I'll just say a few things, then give the meaty details over to Chris. I think it's, again, one of these aspects where if you're saying how fast is something that's a very tiny fraction of the total number of cars in the US been growing, that number can be quite big even though it's been localized. That said, here in California, I think there's been, in terms of the state policy, a lot of attention to the role of transportation because that wedge of our emissions pie is close to 40%. And we've seen, at least in the neighborhood where I rent an apartment, I don't live in one of these houses, but every third car is a Tesla. And I think the same goes for Norway, the same goes for Hong Kong. So there has been increasing momentum, and I think we're going to move towards a world where we need to come up with solutions to transport Small cars in some ways are a lot easier than some of the transport challenges associated with what do we do with airplanes, what do we do with ocean-based shipping. But that may be a world where there are multiple types of transport modes, some of them electric vehicles, some of them hydrogen, perhaps some of them some technologies that we have even yet to contemplate.
Who here drives an electric? Yeah, my family loves the we have the little, well, I'll say the brand. We have a BMW i3 that it's amazingly fun to drive. The point that Catherine makes about we're starting from such a small initial pool that even a doubling is still a tiny penetration. There are lots of reasons to think that electrification of light vehicle transportation has to be a key part of the solution, and the fact that so many manufacturers are making really attractive battery-operated vehicles is I think, a incredibly important development. Unfortunately, the surge in electric vehicle sales has tapered off a little bit as the gas price has been really low, and it's still the case that because the range limitation, that electrics aren't the compelling choice for everyone. It'll be really interesting within the next year or so as we see, in principle, $30,000, $40,000 range cars that have a couple hundred miles of range come from Tesla and General Motors, and I think General Motors is actually supposed to start selling theirs within the next couple of months. Catherine made the point that there are a whole bunch of competing technologies, and the Toyota fuel cell technology and the Matrix vehicle, which is available in Northern California, is also a zero-emitting one, and it has the potential to allow much longer vehicle range, maybe especially important for trucks. But there are other ways that we could solve light transportation in a way that electrified that might be different than long-range battery electric vehicles. There, for example, technologies that let vehicles get electricity from the roadway. It's also possible that we might see technologies where chemical fuels are made from electricity. So we might end up with vehicles that have fuel cell or internal combustion engines that are still zero emitting because the hydrocarbon is made from electricity. Let me just say one final thing about electrification of transportation that I think is really intriguing and really hard to understand what the implications are going to be. But autonomous is getting to be really, really important. Many of you probably noticed that you can now get an autonomous Uber in San Francisco. And once there are autonomous vehicles, you may not even own a vehicle. You may just rent transportation services whenever you need it. And if you need a big car or a small car or whatever, that's what it would appear. And an additional feature of autonomous that I think has the potential to be quite compelling is that if you say, well, how many vehicles do we need to meet the country's light vehicle transportation needs, so the vehicles aren't sitting in your garage for 23 and a half hours a day, it would be a much smaller number of vehicles that were driving many more miles per year, resulting in a much higher turnover of vehicles. So we might actually end up being 3 or 4 generations of vehicles down the road in the same amount of time that we traditionally think of one generation of vehicles, letting the technology advance much more quickly.
All right, thank you. There was a question right here in front, Crystal.
Hello.
And could you stand up, make it easy for our camera folks? Thank you.
You guys mentioned that quite a few actors are getting in on this climate thing. We have the private industry, people like Tesla or organizations. You also noted that a lot of the other countries in the world are looking at this climate thing as a very serious threat, and the overriding feeling at the last meeting was we're going to move on with with or without a friendly Trump administration. Given that the Trump administration is putting people into positions that come from Exxon, and Rick Perry's going to get in there. People who are, from the look of it, pretty antagonistic to really tackling this issue. What is the feasibility of actually keeping it under 2 degrees Celsius without leadership from the U.S. federal government?
Okay. You can think about what it takes to limit warming to 2 degrees Celsius through a pretty simple relationship that emerges from the physics of the climate system, and that's a carbon budget. So when we put carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, the warming from those molecules lasts for millennia. So if you think about the carbon budget for 2 degrees Celsius warming, it's about 3 trillion tons of carbon dioxide, and to date we've emitted about 2 trillion tons. At current levels of emissions, we've got about 2 decades left for a good chance of keeping warming under 2 degrees Celsius. So in many ways that emphasizes that this is a challenge of driving our emissions to zero within this century. So I think this question of, well, what's the role of the US in that? It's essential. I think you could say, well, if we have a 4-year delay, that's something where we could potentially recoup quite profoundly, even though it's really a critical dimension. So I think in some ways the hopeful way to approach this, or perhaps the pragmatic way to approach it, is to think about all the different ways that decarbonization can push forward in the US, even if we have a weakening of the national effort. We've mentioned a lot of those already. It's things like the fact that clean energy is driving forward, that there's strong bipartisan support for the investment tax credit, the production tax credit. It's the fact that that can be about jobs and energy independence, and all these things that have nothing to do with caring about climate per se, even though climate is right there in the connection between that air quality, jobs, energy independence mix.
But it's also really important to recognize that right now, stabilizing warming at less than 2 is going to require a really massive effort. A delay is going to be important. Any delay makes dealing with the problem more expensive and more complicated, and it means we're going to deal with more residual impacts. And so there are lots and lots of things that can be done. It's possible that even if the Trump administration decides to be pointedly unfriendly toward progress on the climate challenge, the world may still keep up much of the progress. I'm confident that it will, but the delay is going to be harmful, and there's no getting away from that.
So with about 30 to 45 seconds left, what's next for the Paris Agreement process? What are the next steps? Are there more annual meetings, sub-meetings, anything like that?
Making it work and bringing up the ambition.
Okay.
Raising ambition is really the key. Countries learning to work with each other, recognizing that this is a problem that can be solved, and that the non-emitting energy is genuinely the good stuff, the things that great nations aspire to provide their own people.
All right. We've been talking with Chris Field, Director of the Stanford Woods Institute for the Environment, and Katharine Mach, Senior Research Scientist at Stanford University. Can I have you back in another year and we'll check in? I like doing these anniversary things. It was nice. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.